Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Well, I am very excited to have Carrie on here today. So I'm going to turn it over to you right away, Carrie, and tell us about who you are.
Great. Thanks, Karen, for having me. My name is Carrie Fox. My pronouns are she and her. I am a communications social impact strategist, and I'll tell you more about what that means. But I'm a communicator and a storyteller, and I use the power of communications for good. So I run an agency called Mission Partners. We're a certified B Corporation, women-owned firm based right outside of Washington, D.C.
That's fantastic. And I know most people are just listening to this as opposed to watching it, but I just put my hands up like, woohoo, women owned. That's just fabulous. Yeah, translate that for us. What does that mean to us here listening?
You got it. So for the past 20 years, I have worked with nonprofit executives and their boards, communications directors, in helping them understand the power of communications. And what I mean by that is there is a lot in what communications can do for an organization who is looking to raise money or advance advocacy and legislation or raise awareness on a critical issue, right? And so much of it, Karen, as you know, and as your audience knows, is how you tell the story, how you engage people in that story and make them part of the story, how you get people to feel a story. And so that's our work. We think about the power of communications to challenge stereotypes, to bridge divides, to address and correct misinformation and disinformation, which we certainly know there's a lot of that these days. But all of it, at the end of the day, we think about the greatest tool to advance social justice in our world is through communications. And so we use every bit of that tool to help advance social justice in our world.
Oh my gosh. I love what you're doing. And can you give us an example that would demonstrate something that like this is exactly a great story or example of what we do?
Sure would. So we worked for many years, in fact, launched a campaign and built a campaign called Success Beyond 18. And it was designed to reimagine the foster care system in the United States. And so some of your listeners may know that for many years, many individuals, young people who were in the foster care system would age out at the age of 18, meaning they were on their own with no supports, no parents, no paycheck, no bank account, and often no place to live on their 18th birthday. And so we set out to build a national campaign that was powered by young people who had aged out of the system to talk about what life could be like if they could stay in care through the age of 25. Meaning, if you can think back to when you were 18,
Oh my
you
gosh.
probably weren't ready to be on your own, right? So by the time you were 25, you had that first job, maybe, you maybe had a car, you maybe had an apartment, you could be ready, right?
Right.
So we went state by state with a number of young people who told their stories. And at the end of this campaign, Success Beyond 18, we had helped to change legislation in 25 states, changing the age out age from 18 to 25. And if you think about the impact that has, not just on a system, but on thousands and thousands of lives, generations of lives, that's the kind of long-term transformational work we like to do.
Oh my gosh. I think that's incredible. Wow. Well, congratulations, by the way, on that. And what a powerful thing to use the power of story to your audience as well.
Right,
That
right.
that's amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you and your confidence journey. Specifically, how did you get into this?
So it's a great question, Karen, because I got into this perhaps not in an expected way. I went to college and studied communications and public relations. My first job was in sports public relations, working with a very high profile athlete who's now in the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Oh, wow.
But
Can
I
you tell us who
realized,
it is? Probably
yes,
not,
it's
huh?
Cal Ripken Jr.
Oh
So I
my
worked with
goodness.
Cal Ripken and his family. I helped them start their foundation. But
Wow.
I realized, and they always knew this about me, that I cared very deeply about the impact of my work and the role that I wanted to play in this work. And so when I was very young, I set out to start my own agency. And I was 25 when I did that. I didn't have a business school degree. I didn't know how to run an agency. I had been in agencies before, but I knew I had something to offer. And I knew there was part of the market that wasn't being filled, which was
Mm,
how do you support nonprofits who often have limited resources, but who have a great story to tell?
mm.
How do you give them the best set of communications and counsel to advance their missions? And that's what I set out to do. And so
Wow.
now, coming up on 20 years later, and we're still doing it, and we've been able to build a very robust business around truly and in a very focused way supporting organizations who can say what we do for the good of others.
Wow. Such a noble mission. Oh my gosh. And 25. That's incredible.
Right, but it gets to the confidence story. I will tell
Yeah.
you that the
Tell me,
confidence
tell me.
story.
Yes, tell us.
So when I started that agency, I had an opportunity very early on. This was the first year of business to present to a board of directors about a campaign concept. And so for those of you who can't see me, this is a podcast. I am a very petite woman. I look younger than I am. I walked into that business meeting when I was 25, and the board chair walked over to me and he said, "Sweetie, it is so nice that you are here. How nice it was that your boss thought to invite the intern to this meeting."
Oh my
And I
God.
said, "Well, hi, sir. It's nice to meet you." Put out my hand. I give him a good, strong handshake. "It's really nice to meet you. My name is Carrie Fox, and I'll be leading the presentation today." And, it took everything I had in that moment to figure out how I was going to do this and win him over. But that's what I knew I needed to do, right? I knew I was going to be the only woman, certainly only woman my age in that room, but I knew
Wow.
I was there for a reason. And that's the thing that I have always been, I've always had wonderful mentors. And those mentors, from Cal Ripken Jr. to many others I've had along the way, have said, "You're here for a reason." And that's what I've held on to.
Wow. Okay. I gotta dive into this a little bit more. What were you feeling inside when he said that?
Oh, Karen, crushed, absolutely crushed. I mean, I could have walked in the other direction and fallen apart, right? Just fallen to pieces because I believed it, right? The reality is I can say on a on a screen here and with a really confident face that I believed I was there for a reason, but I did not feel I was there for a
Hmm.
reason in that moment.
Wow. And that's a really powerful distinction, the belief versus the feeling. And I also want to just share too that what I love that you're pulling out here is the focus and the, I don't know whether it's gumption, drive, all of the above that comes when you have a bigger purpose. Or I mean, I don't want to speak into your story, but it almost feels like it was a calling for you. Would
Right.
say is that true? Or can you speak to that a little bit more about the belief that you
It's
have?
very true. Are you familiar with the concept of ikigai, understanding your
No,
purpose in life?
no, but I want to hear more.
So it's a concept that in Okinawa, Japan, this concept
Okay.
started of really understanding the bigger picture of your purpose in life. And Okinawa is one of 7 blue zones in the world where there is a large population of individuals who live to be 100 or older. And the thought is that Okinawans live so long because they have a very clear and distinct purpose in life.
Hmm.
And so, this idea of purpose is understanding, what am I called to do? What does the world need from me? What do I believe I bring to the world? Where is my greatest value? And
Yeah.
starting to map the answers to some of those questions has allowed me to think about why I'm here and what purpose I can deliver to the world. And for me,
Mm.
it's been since those very early days of business, thinking about the role that communications can play, even when you feel like you're up against an enormous mountain. That stories change lives, right? But it's having the responsibility for how to tell a story to understand the impact, both positive and negative, that a story can have.
I love that about the the impact, the responsibility. That is, I just want to sit in that for a moment. I mean, it's so interesting. I love how you're positioning that because it's so true. And there's so much about storytelling, and certainly over the past, 5 or 10 years, particularly about, especially in business. And yet, do people really get to the emotional component, the details? I mean, there's so many different ways a person can tell a story, but to have the root of that, with that responsibility, that's powerful
Yeah.
to really focus on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I have often told the story of um I remember very distinctly getting a piece of mail a few years ago, and I opened up this letter, and it was a donation request to give to a nonprofit. And the nonprofit was talking about some of their what they positioned as beneficiaries who were in dire straits, and this nonprofit was the hero. If you gave this nonprofit resources in this moment, in this way, they could help X number of additional people. And when I talk about responsibility, it's the responsibility of understanding that a nonprofit is not a savior, right?
Yeah.
People, any individual has inherent power and talent and value. And it's how we tell stories that we are either reinforcing negative stereotypes that exist in our world,
Mm.
or we're changing the narrative in a way that celebrates people's initiative and talent and value. So I think really deeply in how we communicate that stories, coming back to confidence, stories can boost confidence, but they can also break confidence.
Mhm. My gosh, I want you to say all of that again. That was so good. Okay, I had to write this down. Change the narrative that celebrates. But can you say that one more time? Because I really
Yeah,
want to hear that.
absolutely. Absolutely. So it's about changing the narrative in a way that celebrates people's value, initiative, and talent,
Mhm.
right? And I think often when organizations, especially organizations who are trying to fundraise, they'll flip that story in a way that says, give us your money and we can help those in need. Who's to say that people are in need and want those
Beautiful.
resources, right?
Good point. Well, it makes me think about, I'm a huge fan of Donald Miller, who has the company Story Brand, and
Yes.
the power of the hero, like who's the hero. And so that immediately came, it's funny because when you were talking about the nonprofit, like basically, saying how great, I mean, for lack of a better term, how great they were, and what I'm sure that they were doing was very noble as well. But
Right.
it's so interesting how it could be the exact same story, but it's all about how it's positioned.
It's all about how it's
Yeah.
told.
And that whole hero of the story. Well, what advice would you give us for telling stories? I mean, you've already given some in so many terms, but if you were to say, "Hey, here are my top 1 to 3 tips on how to
Right.
tell a powerful story," what would those be?
So the first one is tell your own story. You
Mm,
may have been witness to an incredible experience, but that doesn't mean that's your story to tell. So you can tell a story based on what you've experienced and what you felt and how it has impacted you, but being mindful of telling someone else's story. And we often counsel nonprofits, especially on that, if they are featuring an individual in their annual report. Who
okay.
wrote that story? Who approved that story? And if there is an individual who is the basis of that story, were they paid to share their story? Right. So
Ooh,
always thinking about how can you shift and challenge the power dynamics of who is telling the story, and is it your story to tell?
wow, that's really good. That's really good. Other tips?
Yeah. So on telling stories,
Yeah.
so I think another one is being mindful of um, the intended and unintended consequences of a story. Again, thinking about that story, not just through the way I understand it or you understand it. I'm standing here as a white cisgender woman brought up in a middle class community in the Northeast United States. I will have a certain perspective on how I experience stories. It doesn't mean that Karen, you'll understand or experience that story the same way. So when we share stories, being mindful of how people who have different backgrounds, different beliefs, different understandings might need bridges to understand where you're going with that story versus always assuming that everyone comes at it from the same place. And then the third one is storytelling is nothing without listening. So, how much listening are you doing to inform the stories that you tell rather than saying, I've got such a good story to tell and I'm going to share it. And then it falls flat because you haven't had a chance to get some feedback on the way that that story is landing.
Oh, those are so powerful. Thank you for sharing those tips. Really powerful. That second one reminds me of the curse of knowledge.
Yes.
I love that term. The fact that, and for those who aren't familiar, basically my colloquial version of it is that, the more expert you become, the harder it is to see things through the lens of your listener.
Right.
And that jargon, the buzzwords, the things where people just don't even think about their audience because they're so focused on themselves and not intentionally trying to be that way. But it's like you just said, we each come from our own lens. And are we really thinking about the impact that that story is going to make on others?
Right.
So
Right.
that
Sometimes we're so close to our own stories.
yes,
They become hard to tell.
exactly. Yeah. Well, tell us more about your story. Specifically, I would love to hear a mistake that you made at some point in your career and what you did to recover from that, that we could.
Well, Karen, it's a question of which mistake should I share with you? I feel like I'm on a constant learning journey, and maybe that's the best part about life, right? Is
Right. We all are.
we
Yeah.
learn from those mistakes. Um, I'll share one with you early on that gets to maybe seeing bigger picture. That um, I was on a conference call with a client and a colleague of mine, and we were going through this client was going through a bit of a crisis, and so we were managing him through that. He was very worked up and anxious about what could happen.
Mm.
We wrapped up that call. He hung up, or at least I thought he did. And I immediately said, can we just break that down a minute? Why he felt so anxious about this? Do you think he's overreacting on this? And then we realized he hadn't hung up.
Oh
And he
no.
said, Carrie, do you want to say that again and tell me how you really feel? And again, it was one of those moments, Karen. I thought, oh dear, what have I done?
Oh.
Um, so it was a really careful reminder of be mindful what you say and take a breath. Take a breath before you're. I often find that I need processing time. And as I have grown over my career, I don't go anywhere without my journal, right? So if I'm experiencing something, I write it down and I sit on it, and then I will bring that feedback to the person. And I look for feedback constantly in what I'm doing too. But that was an important reminder for me that um, nothing you say is off the record. Nothing you say is said in private. And so be mindful of how you're sharing and engaging with colleagues along the way.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just sitting with that as I think about what I'm working on right now is to not react. And so hearing that story is good is good for me to learn from as well. And thank you for your vulnerability. That's really, really, I mean, just so appreciated here. I'm grateful.
Yeah, well, hopefully there's something to learn out of that. But for me, it's always been a good reminder that you can never go wrong with taking a breath.
Yeah.
And whether I was judging him in that moment or not, I still sit on that and think about what's my role as a communicator and as a guide and as a member of any support team, that I want to be truly as supportive and empathetic and understanding through a process rather than say, "Ah, that was a silly move," or gosh, why did they do that? That's not my job. My
Right.
job is to understand where they are, to listen deeply about the concerns they have, and to help coach them through that. And that doesn't happen when you're immediately, responding with an emotion.
That's really good advice right there about the responding with an emotion. And I do think that that happens to a lot of us. And it makes me think about one thing that just came as a fluke once when I was coaching a client. She said, she was and you'll appreciate this, she was the executive director of a nonprofit. And she said in front of her board, she would tend to react and speak too quickly about things and react. When I say react, I mean emotional reaction.
Right.
And it was funny because we were just having this conversation. I said, well, what if you just tried some type of mantra like stop, pause, breathe? And she really liked that and it worked for her. But what it did is it forced her because she had that thing at the ready for her. And I think this is just a good reminder to everybody. What thing could you have at the ready for you to be able to, whether it's about reacting versus responding or whatever other thing or situation that happens on a regular basis. But for
Right.
her, she just went, oh my gosh, I just now say stop, pause, breathe. And that helps me to not react.
Absolutely. That's a great one. That's a great device. And to build on that, the other is listen to understand. Rather than listen to react, listen to understand.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Well, what else do you want to say that hasn't been said, or what would you like me to ask you that I haven't asked?
Well, it's interesting. We're talking about confidence, and I've now been at this for a little bit as you have, but I've been thinking a lot about young professionals coming into the work environment. And for us, and I suspect many of your listeners, we are still largely in a remote workforce environment. And
Yes.
how challenging it can be. If I think back to some of those early confidence boosting moments, they happened when I was in person with a coach or a boss or a mentor who said, "You've got this," and who supported me and boosted me up. And there I went. But the rules are all different now, right? So many young people who have graduated this last spring and started a full time job, many of them are entering into remote workforces. Many of them are operating out of their apartment or wherever they work and doing that work on their own, right? And so I would remind those, it comes back maybe to the power and responsibility of communications, is that if you are on a team that has a younger professional on it, take some extra time to find ways to reach out to them, engage with them. I suspect that you can have a big impact in how you might support a young person in building their confidence during a time in this funny world that we're in that can leave a lot of people questioning, what role am I supposed to be playing on this team?
Oh, that's such a great reminder. And it is really interesting when I think about how when you're at a certain age, certainly I'll speak for myself here, but having had a number of years under my belt, it's harder to remember. Oh yeah, because I'm such an encourager, but I so focus on 40 and up. But I think about, gosh, who do I know in my life that could use some encouragement that might be younger in their professional journey? And that is a very good reminder of that. It's
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
A
you for
few
that.
words of encouragement can be transformational to a person who's considering, where do I go in this life and what do I do and how do I make an impact? Just hearing from someone to validate where they are and what path
Mhm.
they're on can go a really
Yeah,
long way. I know it
yeah.
did for me.
Yeah, for me too. I'm actually thinking about a time when I remember years ago when I was telling this, I was on some networking call and an author was leading it. And I remember saying, well, because that was when I had this dream of being a corporate trainer and I was in an HR position. And the woman said something that really surprised me. She said, well, because she said, well, what's your dream? And I said, well, my dream is to be the Oprah of San Francisco. And then she said, well, what could you start doing now that would basically be being you I mean, with your dream of being Oprah? Obviously, I don't want to be Oprah herself, but the advice was so fascinating, which is just start now. And I thought, how am I supposed to start now? I'm not Oprah. But her example of just, hey, get some friends together in your living room and come up with a topic and deliver it to them.
Hmm.
See if they'll listen to you. And I remember as a young person, first of all, just the vision of that possibility made me realize, oh, that's how it starts. But it
Oh,
felt Like, for some reason, I remember thinking as a young person that I had to jump from where I was to that end goal
Right.
when there's obviously lots of incremental steps in between.
Gosh, I love that too so much because it's such a good reminder that so many of us, and this may be more women focused, maybe not, but I will think about this from my perspective as a woman as well, is how many times I've thought I'd love to do that thing, but I'm not there yet. I have to get more experience, or I have to make sure I'm well positioned for this, or I feel like I'm an imposter if I try to do this now, right? And yet, if we just look backwards at the mountains we've already climbed, you know, we've already done a lot to get us
Seriously.
to wherever you are, that you're always starting from someplace along that journey, but it's probably not the first mountain you're climbing ahead of you if you look
Right.
backwards.
Right. That's so good. It's so true. Well, I want to ask one more question about you, Carrie. Would you be willing to share a time, if one comes to mind, where you wished that you had spoken up, but you didn't?
Mm, yeah. I actually wrote a blog about this not too long ago
Oh,
that I've been sitting recently on, this actually comes back to confidence, on the times that I have spoken out and the times that I've held my tongue. And I started to analyze when were those moments that I wanted to say something, but I didn't. And I realized that some of those times were in moments when a few words of encouragement could have gone a long way. And I sat on the fact for why I didn't. And the best I could explain or share with you in this moment is that I always try to find this right balance of wanting to boost someone without overdoing it. Right. And so sometimes I bite my tongue because I think, well, that's their job. Let them keep going and let them play out and let them see for themselves how great they are. But I always regret not celebrating achievements along the way. And so that's what I have found. I try not to regret much, but that's what I
yeah.
found to be really intentional about is even if I've just celebrated someone, why can't you celebrate them a little bit more, right? There's so
Yeah.
much value in just a few words of, you've done great, now keep it up. Great, now I want to see more. Now I want to see more, but let's keep up that in great work. So I think the times that I didn't say something and should have are really around celebration. And so that's become more of what I see as my daily activities now is how can I just reach out and celebrate someone?
Oh, you and I are so simpatico with that. That's one of my top values is celebration. And a big part of it is because there were so many times where I didn't celebrate things. And I just think in general, we don't celebrate enough of our wins. We just move on to the next thing. And I can still remember when I trained for 6 months to hike the Grand Canyon. And it was one of those, you get up at 3 in the morning, you get bussed over there and you hike. And I remember at the top of the cliff or whatever, the canyon, feeling so good. And then moments later, I was in my hotel room. I sat down in my bed with the hiking boots still on, and I thought, okay, what's next? And I remember telling myself, gosh, could you just celebrate for a moment? Do you have to
Right,
be looking to the next goal all the time?
right.
And yet I'm like you. I love celebrating people. So it's definitely something I've tried to be more intentional about related to accomplishments, but always something that I have loved to do as far as encouraging others. So I love that you brought that up.
And we made it a practice, actually, maybe this is a tip for others, is
Yes.
we have made it a practice where every Monday in our staff meeting, we have something called Foxies. My last name is Fox. My my dog's name is Baxter Fox. And so we have these little dollar bills that we would hand out. They say, in Baxter Fox, we trust. And you
Oh,
can give a Foxy to anyone on the team. And often, Karen, I'll sit back and just watch this magic happen as people are celebrating one another for great work and being a wonderful partner and for showing and showcasing the values of the company. That it's really become a deep part of our culture is celebration. And then people can redeem those Foxies for all kinds of special gifts, all from Black owned businesses. And so, again, another way of thinking about how we're
wow.
living that value. But it's a really fun thing to sit back and watch celebration happen.
Well, and to think that you created that. That is amazing. So I want to celebrate you right now with who you are and what you're doing in the world. It's a beautiful and powerful thing. So
Oh, thank you.
thank you. Yeah. Well, Carrie, where can people reach you?
Sure. So you can reach me if you want to reach me directly. LinkedIn is the best spot. Carrie Fox PR. You'll find me there. But the website of our agency is mission.partners. So you can check it out and learn more about our work.
Awesome. Thanks so much for being here today, Carrie. It was great.
Thank you, Karen.
And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.